Thank you, everyone, for being here and welcome. Um, it's been really a delight as PRN's policy director this year to watch the energy around parking reform at the state level. There's been really some incredibly strong bills in a bunch of U.S. states all over the country, red states, blue states, you name it, that would curtail or roll back local parking mandates. I think it's really been a banner year. And at PRN, just to be able to talk with the advocates, the organizations that are helping to really advance this legislation and watch them learn from each other in real time. As you know, we as a movement try to figure out what works and what is possible, and where can we push more effectively. So this panel's been the product of a bunch of those conversations over the last 6, 7 months, and I'm really excited to that we get to bring this to you today. So without further ado. We have 6 panelists today, and I'm going to ask each of them in turn to introduce themselves, where they're from, who they work with, and what the legislation was that they contributed to working on this year. And let's start with Catie Moran from Connecticut Parking Reform.
Thanks, Daniel. So my name is Catie Moran. I am coming to you from Hartford, Connecticut, the what I'll claim to be the first city to get rid of their parking mandates in the modern era. And I co-founded a group, CT Parking Reform, this session about 6 months ago, 9 months ago now. And we ended up with a bill going through the State House. It got through committee that was a full repeal of all parking mandates in the entire state of Connecticut. It got compromised down and merged together in a broader housing omnibus bill that then got vetoed by our governor. It would have gotten rid of all of our parking mandates for all of our residential uses in the entire state, and then it failed and tripped over the finish line. That's a story for another day, but appreciate being here and appreciate all the help that PRN lent along the way in our journey.
Appreciate all your work, Catie. Thank you. Next, we have Katie Gould from the Sightline Institute.
Hi, I'm Katie Gould. I'm a senior researcher with Sightline, and I'm calling in today from Portland, Oregon. But this bill that we're covering was in Washington. It put a cap on residential and commercial parking mandates statewide, um, and we passed. This law is in, well, it'll be implemented in, I don't know, 16 months from now for most jurisdictions in the state. In addition to the caps, there are a variety of specific building uses that have the full flexibility, no mandates at all. So I like to describe it, it's kind of complicated. There's a lot of pieces to it, but that parking mandates should no longer be a barrier to construction for the majority of projects in the majority of jurisdictions across the state. So that was a big win in Washington. So happy to dive in more.
Thanks, Katie. Next up, we have Felicity Maxwell from Texans for Housing.
Everybody, calling in today from Austin, Texas, and I'm the executive director of Texans for Housing. And we had a surprise parking bill this year at our Texas legislative session. Came out of nowhere. It would basically in a statewide repeal of commercial parking mandates specifically. Sadly, we did not get to be the biggest state to reform parking this year. It died in committee, but I think it was a great opportunity for us to highlight the issue and to start this conversation in Texas, which would be transformative, we're hoping. So excited also to dive in about where we failed and where we might succeed the next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Felicity. Yeah, parking reform is a live conversation in Texas, and as one of the biggest states, we've got to have it represented here. Next up, we have, excuse me, Nathan Dugan from Shelter Whitefish in Montana. I hope I got your name right. Nathan, are you there?
I think we can't hear you, Nathan.
We have your audio, Nathan.
What about that? There it is. Cool.
Yes. Yes.
Thought I had that figured out before, but yeah. Thanks, Daniel. I'm Nathan Dugan from Shelter WF, Shelter Whitefish. We're a pro-housing advocacy organization in Whitefish, Montana. I'm actually calling in right now from a parking meter spot in Milwaukee. That's why I'm kind of trapped here and I can't move. And if my computer moves around a little bit, it's because it's on my lap. So I apologize for that. But we were able to get a bill passed through the legislature and signed in Montana this year that greatly reduced parking minimums, I guess, to one space for all residential uses. And then we've got two different planning paradigms in Montana. So depending on kind of what a city is under, either fully eliminated for residential units under 1,200 square feet, or capped it at 0.5 parking spaces for those residential units under 1,200 square feet. And then also eliminated parking requirements for existing buildings undergoing a change of use, childcare facilities, deed restricted affordable housing, or assisted living facilities. So fairly comprehensive. There's some commercial stuff in it initially that got taken out, unfortunately, but I think we're all pretty happy with kind of what happened in Montana. Happy to talk about it a little bit more in depth later on.
Awesome. Thank you, Nathan. Next up, we have Nick Taylor from Housing Action, New Hampshire.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks for putting this panel together and everyone for being here. So I'm Nick Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Action, New Hampshire. We're a statewide pro-housing advocacy organization in New Hampshire, as the name suggests. We have been working on parking reform the last couple of years, and just last week had a bill signed into law that would prohibit municipalities from requiring more than one spot for any residential development. And that built upon a bill we had passed last year that was capping at 1.5 spots for 10 plus unit multifamily development. So we started there, and we'll talk more about that, but started there and then had a big success throughout the legislative session, and look forward to seeing it implemented and building upon this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our last panelist today is Ryan Carter from Catawba Riverkeeper in North Carolina.
Thanks, Daniel. Hey, everyone. My name is Ryan Carter from the Old North State, North Carolina. We've been working with legislators this session. Real quick, I'm a conservation lobbyist, so it's great to be on a panel with housing folks and local government advocates as well. This is a huge issue in the conservation space. There's nothing worse for the environment than a parking lot. So we've been working with legislators on House Bill 369, which does several things. It's in our world, we call it a stormwater bill. Everybody else, it's called a parking reform bill, but it is a clean repeal across the state of all local parking minimum ordinances. Earlier this month, it passed the House unanimously in a 107-0 vote, and is now awaiting committee referral in the North Carolina Senate.
Thank you, Ryan. Yep. That North Carolina bill to me is the most exciting unanswered question right now in parking reform in North America. Awaits to be seen, but really, really exciting what's going on there. I like Felicity's suggestion. Are you making 107-0 t-shirts? All right. Thank you to our 6 panelists. To kind of keep things moving here, I've got some questions that I am going to put to various members of our panel, and then we'll have some time at the end for audience Q&A. We have a lot of people in the audience today, so the best way, as you think of a question that you want to put to one or more of our panelists, if you can write that in the chat, we will be keeping an eye on those, and we will get to as many of them as we can toward the end here today. All right, so to begin with, I think kind of the most important, the most obvious question here is what works? What should we be doing more of? So I want to start with that one with, what is something that you did this year that worked really well? And in particular, like in terms of, let's first talk about in terms of the coalition building and the politics piece. Who were your most important allies? How did you put together that coalition, and how did your allies matter to the fight for parking reform? Why don't we start with Ryan on that one?
Yeah, for sure. So a little bit of context: North Carolina, big Dillon's rule state, no local control. And I call it, it's a polka dot state. It's red with blue dots. So we have a Republican near functional supermajority. So we have to work within that context, and knowing that conservation, tree huggers isn't always popular, knowing that there are other perspectives. So one, affordable housing groups being able to go in and talk to developers, being able to talk that language with legislators who have a development background. knowing that going after good governance, legislators and interest groups of, why are we setting these arbitrary numbers? This should be a market-driven decision. But finding those key messengers from a different perspective. We have a lot of healthcare legislators, and so talking about bringing those public health perspectives and talking about nighttime temperatures and heat strokes. And we're having a very hot summer here in North Carolina. And you walk out to the surface parking lot at the legislature and you're feeling it. So what are we doing to reduce that? Encourage tree canopy. So really, this is one of those issues that we have found, particularly in North Carolina, that that sprawl is something that no one loves to see. And so there's different messengers for different legislators here in North Carolina. But yeah, that alliance between conservation groups and affordable housing advocates has been really, really dynamic.
Really cool. I'm interested kind of in, watching all this unfold, how the coalitional politics of this are the same, and different across, very different political environments. Catie, I'd love to hear a bit from your experience, assembling this coalition in a deep blue state in Washington. How is it the same? How is it different? And who do you find was really key to winning support in the legislature?
Yeah. Well, some important context is that there was a parking reform bill that was attempted 2 years ago that didn't go very far in the committee. It was focused around transit. It had a freshman legislator from Seattle sponsoring the bill. This year was a really different dynamic. One, because a lot of other housing supply legislation had passed in the past few years, legalizing, triplexes, fourplexes, backyard ADUs. So the state has been doing more zoning reform and kind of rolling over the cities that are opposed in recent years. And there's a big focus on housing affordability and housing supply. Washington is a really rapidly growing state in terms of population. This year we had a really great sponsor who was directly involved in that middle housing legislation that was bipartisan. So that alone really changed the nature of the conversations that we were having with other organizations who have known for years that parking minimums are a barrier to construction. They're a problem, but trying to get people to think that this is a politically solvable issue, was hard. So getting this big name sponsor really changed that. So other groups kind of prioritized this on their list of issues that they wanted to focus on during the session. We had, and we kind of were the ringleaders of the coalition and tried to make it really easy for groups to sign on to a coalition letter, letting them know when to testify. And we had a range of organizations from affordable housing developers to people from the building industry. But most importantly, I think getting support from local cities. Cities have typically been the main opposition to this type of legislation, and getting people from city councils, from towns of different sizes around the state, both who have done parking reform at the local level and some places who have not, to say, we really support the state doing this, we want this to happen, this would be good for our communities, was so critically important to breaking kind of the optics of saying, great, all the developers support this, but what about all the cities oppose it, right? That we had cities on both sides weighing in. So that really helped kind of move that conversation along for us.
Casey, the first time I heard your name was when you and Tom Broderick reached out to PRN saying, "Hey, we love your parking lot map tool, and we want to map the surface parking in every single municipality in Connecticut." And then I blinked, and lo and behold, you'd done it. But that was the first I heard of this really remarkable campaign that your group put together there. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your experience of finding supportive legislators and building a coalition that could put some legs on this thing.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So I'll make a little bit more of an introduction. I'm probably the most amateur of everybody here. Nobody that was involved in our efforts this year in any way works full time on these issues. We all have day jobs, and this is something that we kind of connected over beers, over the internet over the last couple of years, and just landed on parking reform as a potential opportunity this year. And we decided to run with it. So we reached out, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without PRN. Quick plug, if you're not a member, you definitely should be. It is quite literally making change and inspiring people like us in Connecticut to do what we did. But it started with kind of a crazy idea, and something Ryan said is understanding the local context. Much like North Carolina, we are a Dillon state rule, but you wouldn't know it if you actually lived here. The word local control is a word that gets thrown around like it's candy. It is quite hard to make any change. We haven't really done any big housing reform. We haven't done any zoning reform in the state of Connecticut. So a couple of us got together and said, where is an opportunity that we could potentially work and get something passed? We have, the last couple of years, trying to get something done in the housing world, have failed in pretty much every way we've tried. And this is a non-housing, non-zoning, kind of very flexible message that we identified, and we reach out because I've been a member of PRN for a few years now. I've seen their parking lot maps. I've seen everybody else's success around the country, and I was jealous. So it started with how do we go about actually succeeding? Who do we line up to be supportive of us? And that meant housing folks, that meant Safe Street folks, that meant environmentalists, that meant developers, that meant some small business support. We had made friends with a couple legislators, and we wanted to get ahead of all of the potential points of opposition. Mostly, what are you talking about? We don't have enough parking in my town because my town is special. So we endeavored to map all of the parking in all 169 towns in the entire state of Connecticut, all of our train station downtown areas, not all of the sprawl, because we're not crazy. We're not that crazy anyway. And we came up with something like a third of the entire state's downtowns, main streets by land area is parking. And that ended up being a really powerful shift in people's worldviews of, oh, okay, maybe I can check my priors and maybe I can consider something like this. So when the bill came up the first time, we had a clean repeal across the entire state that made it all the way through committee, and quite frankly, wasn't that far from actually hitting the floor of the House.
Awesome. Awesome. One, I think there's kind of a nice transition there because you're talking about, we knew a couple legislators. We wanted to figure out, what would it take to actually make this work? But then you also got into the messaging of how are we going to communicate the merits of this issue on which, a whole bunch of people don't have a firmly formed opinion and don't know all that much. So I want to segue a little bit into people's experiences with messaging, and in particular, what did you find? What do you find resonated? What lessons did you learn about how to talk about the issue in your own political context? Maybe we'll go to Nick first with that question, in New Hampshire.
Yeah, sure. So it is a really interesting question, especially in everyone's unique political environment. I mean, here in New Hampshire, we have Republican control of all House, Senate, and governor. We have a fully Democratic federal delegation, and we have this sort of long live free or die ethos as like our state's motto. And so that libertarian streak is an anti-regulation streak is really there, but we're also a very rural state, right? And so as you're thinking about some of the parking reform, one of the messages that kept sort of coming up for us was, okay, well, if it's a rural state, you need a car to get around, and really making sure that when we're having this policy debate, we're not making it a referendum on whether people drive cars in New Hampshire. It's about who's making that decision and whether that should be something that there should be this broad, overarching, unnecessary sort of one size fits all approach to it. And so that was really how we started to shape this of who makes that decision. And then it was also within the context of us running a number of pro-housing bills, and some folks have already brought this up in the coalition context, but it was really important that this wasn't solely a vote on parking, that it was a vote, even though they were all separate individual bills, but this was thinking about it in the context of ADUs and mixed use zoning and other density pieces that started to put this into if you are in favor of addressing the number one issue in our state, which is housing, you're going to be also supporting parking reform. And so having that message, having it brought into those existing coalitions, and having those same folks bringing it forward was really important. And we ended up having about half or 2/3 of the Democrats and about half or little under half of the Republicans. And so that was sort of the caucus or the vote math that made it work. And so you needed those messages that hit both sides in a very New Hampshire based context.
Catie, I'm going to go to you next and then to Nathan with this question. But Catie, I know that you took a very deliberate approach to messaging the bill, to communicating the importance of the bill, but also that was really tied to the policy design itself, and in particular the choice to not center it around public transit. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to yeah, what your approach to messaging was.
Yeah, 2 years ago, the bill around transit, it really kind of the concerns were coming from the suburban cities, right? People still drive here. You can't rely on public transit. People aren't going to get rid of their cars and start taking the bus because of this policy, right? And yes, I agree. That's probably not going to happen. And we wanted to sidestep that whole debate about, do people drive cars or not? Like, of course, people who drive cars today are going to drive cars tomorrow after this law changes. So what we did is, the bill that we had all these specific kind of building uses, we found examples. A lot of legislators, they don't want to cause problems for cities who are saying parking minimums are a critical tool to manage automobiles in our jurisdiction. And we had to really point out specific examples of how these policies are causing harms today. There's a lot of fears about what might happen in the future with some new apartment building or without these regulations. And from all the conversations I've had over the last few years, grew very convinced there is no data that I can give anyone to reassure them that those fears are exaggerated and won't come to be, right? So in a lot of our testimony coaching said, focus on the harms today, right? We had some really specific examples. One story was of a daycare that they found room for 29 parking spaces on their property, and they needed 32, and decided not to go through a variance process, and that city still has no new daycare spots because that project didn't move forward, right? Even the lobbyists that are like really oppositional to this bill, we can all agree that that's an unreasonable situation to not open a new business over 3 parking spaces, right? A woman who bought a property, moved to this town to take care of her aging mother. She can't build a house on her own property that she owns because the city requires 4 parking spaces, right? Like, these are examples that even people who are skeptical of this reform and are worried about the future can agree that these situations shouldn't be happening to residents in their state right now. So in the testimony, I was usually called up first, and I would just give real life examples. A restaurant in this town is required to have this many parking spaces. This other town, they require 3 times as much, or this much for inside and this much for outside, and just really give people the scope of how variable these rules are, and these specific examples of really reasonable, kind of common sense building projects that aren't moving forward because of these regulations, and why the state needs to help make this easier for people. So that's kind of our number one messaging tip, is just orienting that conversation around the trouble these rules are causing today to real people.
Fantastic. Yeah. Nathan, I'm curious, what was your messaging experience around this issue in Montana? And how did it differ from what some of our other panelists have shared?
Yeah, I mean, so similar to Nick in New Hampshire, we've got Republican majorities in both houses and a Republican governor. And so we're working within that context, although we definitely have to get Democratic votes to move these things out of committee and to win on the floor generally as well. I'm happy that I saw Catie's PDF that they put together, and I'm happy I didn't have to do anything like that, because much like Casey, I'm pretty amateur at this. I'm a physical therapist full time, and hopefully have found a way to maybe transition into doing this a little bit more full time. But I watched the hearing again before the panel here today, the first hearing in the House Local Government Committee, which tends to be our more challenging committee to get any of these housing related bills and this parking bill out of. And the messaging that I think was relevant in that committee to kind of speak to this more Republican majority typically was initially that bill had some commercial stuff in it. And so there was some small business arguments that were made. That final bill still has childcare and assisted living facilities, and so some of that probably carried through the whole session. There was just a lot of hammering on pro affordability. Housing prices in Montana went up just so fast over the course of the pandemic across the entire state, which has really helped us to kind of move a lot of this stuff through really fast. And I think that that might be waning a little bit now that we're getting beyond a couple years beyond the end of the pandemic. And so things feel like they're getting a little bit harder, but that pro affordability aspect continue to resonate with legislators on both sides of the aisle. Also messaging about kind of just leaving the decision about how many parking spaces to build to developers or those business owners who really know what they're going to need, while acknowledging at the same time that parking probably will still be built in most cases. This isn't saying that a city can't impose an arbitrary minimum parking requirement on a certain type of development. Doesn't mean that every development is not going to have parking. Developers are still going to build parking, but they're going to build what they think they need, or you know what that land can accommodate. So that is the messaging, I guess, that we kind of used throughout the session in Montana to speak to that more conservative side of the aisle. And then I think, you know, everybody probably hit the other side of the aisle here. So that is, I'm shocked that it went through kind of as seemingly easy as it did, but I'm happy.
One thing that we see at PRN again and again that I'll just call out because as a thread in multiple people's kind of testimony here is when you're talking to legislators, decision makers, you know, about this issue, like it's really tempting as an advocate who's been immersed in it to assume that they understand more than they do. And sometimes it really just needs to be said, like, no, this bill won't eliminate parking. You will still be able to build parking. Like that may seem obvious, but like to some of the people you're going to have conversations with, it needs to be said. There's a lot of that. In terms of sort of the internal sausage making, you know, I'm curious kind of how, you know, different folks' experiences here with how important it was to have the right bill sponsor or the right champions and key committees within the legislature. You know, how did factors like that shape your experience? Why don't we start with Felicity, who we haven't heard from yet, out of Texas?
I was just gonna say, I can't wait to
Well,
share.
you had an interesting
Yeah,
circumstance
no,
too, where you
we
had
have
the surprise
very,
parking bill.
we did. And so for y'all who don't know, in Texas, we have a very short legislative season. Basically, we start in January, we finish in June. It's every other year. So you have 180 days to get things done. That also means that out of nowhere, things happen. And that's exactly what happened to us in Texas this year. We literally had a parking bill filed related to eliminating commercial parking requirements statewide by an extremely conservative freshman member who had just gotten elected in November. We had not talked to her staff. We had no idea this was coming and sort of popped up on our feed, our legislative feed, and suddenly we're like, oh my God, this bill's great. So to answer your question is there was no strategy behind this because we didn't even know the legislative office was going to do it. But of course, once they did, we were scrambling to sort of make sure it got a hearing, make sure we had the right testimony. And I will say, like, I think we made a huge impact and impression given that that was kind of an unexpected bill for us to see in our legislative season. So essentially, once it was filed, we did start talking to the office. We did have the right advocates there. We were really trying to understand what they were trying to accomplish. And what's funny to hear all your messaging, because that's exactly what this very conservative Texas Republican was basically saying, is that she didn't like the fact that there were excessive parking requirements related to commercial parking. She herself had done some development or, you know, sort of been a real estate investor type. She had a very active person in her own district that was really adamant about how bad commercial requirements in sort of suburban Texas cities were hurting their ability to grow. He actually had written a whole book about it, and so brought the book to actually testify. And this is like a very Texan person coming to say to a Texas legislative group saying like, this is unequal and unfair and unnecessary, all kind of very Republican coded. So it was really outstanding. And I will say that something y'all didn't touch on, but I thought was really important is that we were very clear about how much junk science is in parking. And that's something those legislative people had not heard before. So we were really glad to bring the messaging, but going back where we started, unfortunately, we didn't have the right team, quite honestly, is because this conservative person was really excited about making the sort of splash with parking reform, they weren't actually interested in doing the work. And funny that I went back and looked at the comments that we got as a part of that hearing, and there were so many cities that came out of the work across Texas being exactly like this: fear mongering. We're not going to be able to parking. This is government overreach. We want local control, because we have, of course, hadn't had a chance to do that work with those Texas cities prior to this bill getting introduced and then having a hearing. So we sort of can see exactly what went wrong, because it's probably not the way we would have planned it. But given the circumstances, I think we did a great job with what we were given. And I will say another thing to touch on is that we also learned a little bit of like, it's that hiding your veggies for your kids in the food, because we did get some very small parking reforms in all of our housing bills that we passed. So essentially limits on how many parking spots can be required for some of our new commercial developments or our new multifamily mixed use. So every time we were doing a housing bill, we tried to put a little bit of parking requirements and restrictions in there. And I think between that and this hearing, we're really well positioned to do some actual real reforms in the next legislative session. So in some ways, it wasn't as much as we would have liked, but we sort of got some momentum going, and I think we can build on that going forward. And we'll probably have the right people and the right stakeholders at the table before we even start the next session, which hopefully will lead to a better level of success.
Felicity, just could you briefly describe the housing bills you referenced that did go through?
Yeah, so we did. We actually had a really successful session. This is aside from parking reform, we actually had basically 7 major bills passed in Texas, which is kind of phenomenal. Essentially, some of the big ones were single stair. We approved that as a statewide code. We have what we call minimum lot size, which is basically for suburban development. So that means that you can't require parking if you're doing a smaller lot size in these new suburban areas. So that's an example. We also have our big one, which is commercial and residential and commercial. That's SB 840, which basically says land in Texas that's zoned commercial can now be used for mixed use and multifamily. There's a parking cap in that one as well. So essentially, all of these big bills that we passed, there's another one related to HUD manufacturing. They're going to require zones. We're hoping that we can put a parking kind of cap on that one as well. So each one of these pieces that we did this session, we have the chance to use that as an opportunity to do some additional parking reforms in the next session as a follow-up to that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, SB 840 was the particular one that I got really excited about when I heard about that, in part because I mean, parking reform is part of broader kind of land use reform, and you can think of it as like, a door with a bunch of deadbolts, and if you unlock one of them, it may not do a whole lot on the ground. If you unlock all of them, stuff starts to happen. So that residential and commercial bill, I look at that and I say like, it's not a parking bill, but that is parking reform. That is a whole bunch of commercial properties with way more parking than they'll ever need. And you've just unlocked, in tandem with potentially future parking reforms, the ability to really do something better with that landscape.
And actually, to your point, I think it was so easy for our Texas legislators to say, oh, yes, of course we should allow more residential and commercial spaces, because you would literally describe, haven't you been to a suburban parking like shopping center where there's so much excess parking? They could picture it. They could see it. They could say, oh, yeah, this is an underutilized piece of land. So even though we weren't doing parking reform when we were saying those things, they knew that that space was being misused. And I think, again, that's priming us for a better session related to parking reforms specifically next time around.
Ryan, I'd love to hear a bit more from you about the experience of building bipartisan support within the legislature. You've sort of memorably described your set of sponsors of this bill to me as like just the ultimate kind of like odd combination of people you would never expect to co-sponsor a piece of legislation together. So
yeah, for sure. Our strange bedfellows of parking lot reform in North Carolina. Looking at who is on the bench. In North Carolina, you can have 4 primary sponsors, and then you can have whoever else wants to sign on as a co-sponsor. So the real moneymaker is your primary sponsors in North Carolina. So one, our first primary sponsor, Representative Loftus, his district is kind of the retention pond of our entire river basin. Everybody's runoff ends up in his district. So he is acutely aware of how water moves, and that parking lots are a big part of runoff. So we have a trusted friend and ally who is willing to work on stuff with us, who's willing to push back against different interest groups and say, did you talk to Riverkeeper? Did you talk to Ryan about it? Oh, you didn't? Cool. Get the hell out of my office. So that's always helpful. The second one, also from his perspective, he used to be a county commissioner. So he was able to put that hat on and go to North Carolina. We had some coastal legislators who'd said, well, people are parking everywhere. What are you going to do about it? How do you explain that? This is important. He said, well, distinguished colleague, that's an on-street parking issue. That's your town's problem. This has nothing to do with that. So it sounds like you've got some on-street parking issues, and if they're in the state right of way, that's your territory, dear state legislator. So there is that perspective. He's a bit of a bulldog too, and so he'll go up and get in somebody's face about something. We had another bulldog on the bill, Representative Mark Brody. He's a developer by trade. Every year he's kind of in the mix for the home builder omnibus bill. But he really got pissed off when he saw how much wasted space was in his district at the big box stores. And so he was able to push back and say, when people said, well, there's not going to be any parking. And he said, well, as a developer, I can't get a loan from the bank if I don't have parking spots. So we are able to have that perspective. So we had two bulldogs. We needed to get kind of a elder statesman, a cooler head. And we found one who is a farmer who lives downstream of Raleigh and Durham. So he really gets water nutrient problems. And he can go out to his farm, get a water sample from the river that he draws water to irrigate his fields, and point out under a microscope and say, this is from Durham, this is from Raleigh, this is from the parking lot down the street. So there's our three Republicans. But being a nonprofit, we really needed to have that bipartisan support. So Representative Dahl from Wake County, she's flaming pink hair, great energy, not who you would expect to be on this bill, but she's got some more bulldog energy where she's able to go have very frank conversations with her caucus and get them on board. So, but she does have a background in healthcare. So she's able to kind of speak to that. How does this factor into not just the built environment, but our health as well? So after that, when we got down to our additional sponsors, we said geographic spread. That's really important. So we've got mountains, coast, Piedmont, our middle of the state. So if that way, at least we can say, well, look, someone from your area, they signed on to the bill. But those four primaries were really important. And we targeted them all. Three of the four are all on one committee that we knew the bill would go to. And so that really helped kind of grease the gears to get it through that troublesome committee, having three of them in there, one of them being the committee chair, so he could just schedule the bill for whenever he wanted to. And when opposition legislators wanted to speak, he just ignored them. So definitely recruit the committee chairs to be on your bills.
Sage advice. Nick, coming from another state where bipartisan support was really crucial, who were your sponsors and how did that affect the trajectory of this thing?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally echo what's been said here around the importance of having people that are going to fight for it, being leading the effort and being sort of your named sponsors. It was also really important for us to be able to have people that could talk within their caucus, right? Because we talked a little bit about the messaging piece, but certainly the message that was being really driven through the Republican caucus and sort of in the libertarian-minded folks versus talking a lot more about some of the things. Ryan, you've talked about some of the things we've seen in the chat about the environmental benefits and the climate change impacts. Like we had folks who were in the Democratic caucus making those arguments. That wasn't our public facing argument, but it was really important that we had, senators on both caucuses, House members in both caucuses who were armed with all the different talking points. And that's where we started to be able to get a little bit deeper and talk about some of the other, how would you address a question on snow? Or how would you address a question on rural communities? How would you address a question if it's from, someone who's a coastal or a resort town or doesn't have, any sort of even public bus system in their community? And so, being able to have those folks strategically spread out throughout the legislature that were ready to answer questions was really important, because we knew, very jealous of that 107 to 0 vote, but we knew we weren't getting 100% of any caucus here and needed that broad range. And luckily, sort of our prime sponsors and our various committee chairs and ranking members were all on board. And so that leadership coordination was a big help too when it came to some of the other process pieces of scheduling and amendments and when are the floor votes coming and all of that, which, as folks know, can be just as important in some ways as the public messaging is like the under the dome. How are you actually making it happen? And when is it going forward to give it the best chance of success?
I want to pivot a little bit to talk about the biggest challenges that we faced as advocates for parking reform, for land use reform, and in particular, what are the sources of opposition that you found it difficult to counter, or what are the messaging pieces that seem to really stick from the opposition that gave you the most trouble? Maybe we will let's start with Nathan on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big piece of opposition that came in into the hearings that we weren't anticipating at all, because the bill kind of directly calls this out and talks about it, was opposition, I guess, from the some disabled advocates, and regarding ADA spaces and that sort of thing. We did have that in the bill. It kind of leads the bill and says, except to provide accessible parking spaces as required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then it goes into the restrictions there after, but I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but it definitely, I think, became like a sticky point for a couple of legislators and didn't ultimately impact the bill, but we weren't ready for it. I'm a physical therapist also, so I understand, I recognize the need for that, and I'm happy that it's in the bill explicitly. But yeah, we weren't ready for that, and thankfully didn't kill the bill, but caught us off guard, I guess, and was really the only like real opposition other than the League of Cities and maybe a couple other people that were worried about not finding a place to park and that sort of thing, but kind of was the only real opposition we saw in Montana.
I think League of Cities is the elephant in the room that we're going to get to here in a bunch of places. I'm curious, Catie, if you would have anything to add to sort of the disability conversation. My sense is that in Washington, the disability rights groups have been useful allies for land use reform, and that there's been some work. But yeah, in terms, like, was that something that came up? Was that something that you proactively countered?
Yeah, we have a good relationship with Disability Rights Washington that advocates for a lot of policies to make it easier for people that can't drive. But they also have lots of members that depend on their cars. So it's not like a slam dunk, this type of policy, but we did have a really good meeting early on in the session with their organization, and we ended up adding an amendment to the bill for the State Building Code Council to do just a study about the ratios of accessible parking spaces that are required in the building code. Right now, they're tied to the federal ADA ratios. We think that there's a good case to be made that those ratios probably need to be higher to reflect the number of people with disabilities who are registered drivers. So that was that one amendment. We got some testimony to speak to it. So it was nice, right, that lawmakers said, okay, we're going to look into this and make sure that the number of spots are adequate. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes forward with that study in a couple of years. But that was kind of the compromise that we made to get support.
There's already a mention of the League of Cities. I think almost everywhere I've seen a parking bill that had some legs, the primary source of opposition, it's been either, the statewide municipal league or individual municipalities coming out. We saw here in Minnesota, I'm certainly not the expert to talk about the bill that we had here, but one thing that we definitely saw was individual legislators who opposed parking reform because the mayors of cities in their district or those cities, took a position against, and they weren't going to go against local electeds. So yeah, I'm curious, folks' experience with, sort of that local control argument being raised. What did you do to counter it? Where did that frustrate you? Nick, you want to weigh in on that one a little bit first?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was definitely for us our sort of biggest opponent during this was the municipal association, which is our sort of League of Cities, and that local control idea. I mean, we're a state where for most towns, any zoning change goes before town meeting, so the entire town can vote if they want to approve it. And so that is sort of deep-seated New England's town meeting culture. And so getting over that was really important. But one of the things that we did was start to call out some of these sort of extreme examples. And so we had some communities that were requiring 3 or 4 parking spaces for an accessory dwelling unit. And so being able to just like highlight the extremes and sort of make folks that were pushing that local control argument defend that and sort of say, this is what you are enabling by continuing to support the status quo. And so putting yourself sort of on that common sense side as things move forward. And then, to move back onto some of the other messaging pieces that we talked about, like explaining to mayors or folks that were having some outreach from their town manager or town planner or city planner that, again, this didn't mean there would be no parking. It's flexible. There's a lot of resources out there. And Catie and the team at the Sightline Institute has done a tremendous job as has Parking Reform Network about bringing forward these ideas and these other communities and highlighting how they approach it. And so being able to highlight that Buffalo, New York has done some of this. There are communities in Canada that have done this. They get snow. Like there are rural towns that do this. And so you're able to highlight that this isn't just a LA or New York City or San Francisco thing, that this is something that can happen in all of our communities. And so that was huge for us to be able to sort of overcome that. Well, they're not like our community, but there are examples, and there were examples in New Hampshire of smaller municipalities that had gone ahead and done it. And so we're able to, again, highlight these regional examples, come over, and then bring forward those extreme pieces to sort of push back on the idea that the status quo can't continue like that.
Ryan, I see your hand up. If you have something to add to this conversation, please.
Yeah, just real quick, dealing with, your League of Cities in North Carolina's the League of Municipalities or the County Commissioners Association. If you're in a Dillon's Rule state where you can do a statewide ban on a statewide nullification, it helps to have a trade-off in there. So part 1 of our bill does the parking reform bit, but part 2 is this really nuanced, wonky stormwater bit that all the local governments really, really, really want. And so they're willing to shut up about the parking lot bit in order to get the stormwater bit. Just like the development community, the builders, they really, really, really want the parking lot bit and they hate the stormwater bit, but they're willing to be quiet about it because they want the other thing. And so having that needle threading of, yes, if you're gonna already going in, you're gonna make someone mad, is there a carrot that you can give them? And so that's been our approach in North Carolina.
Yeah, can you soften their opposition by giving them something they do want? I think that's really, really smart. I want to raise 1 or 2 other things on this question that I know we want to get to, and then make sure we have some time to sort of pivot to audience questions. And then at the end, we'll do a last kind of question for everyone on our panel about just what's your key takeaway or your key lesson learned, kind of summing up. Before we get to that, on the opposition messaging, Catie, you've said something to me a couple times that I wanted to make sure gets addressed here. The objection from municipalities, I think we saw this one in Connecticut too, who say, you're going to require us to manage our curbs. If you're going to allow people to build not enough parking, like we can't do that. How did that message come through from skeptical legislators, and how do you answer that? What do you say in response to that?
Oh, this is so hard. I feel like this is one of the things that I was less prepared to answer during session than I wanted to, but right, cities already have the authority to manage their curbs. We'd like to point out that local spillover parking issues are block by block problems that can require block by block solutions, and requiring a one size fits all requirement that every single building build a predetermined number of parking spaces is an extremely expensive and wasteful solution to that problem. Yeah, I don't think that doesn't tip any cities over, but it does make their complaints seem a little bit less reasonable.
Gotcha. Yeah. I've been watching the chat here out of one eye there. We have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm wondering, Paula, do you by any chance have like a running list of them, or do you want to help me out a little bit here? Because I know there's somewhere I'd have to scroll way up to see at this point. Um, but I
Yes,
think
and
I need to field some questions from the chat. And at this point, I think our panelists, if you can just use the raise hand feature in Zoom if you want to just speak to a particular question, that might be the best way forward here.
yeah, actually, some of the questions have been answered by the panelists. So thanks also the panelists that have been checking the chat. We have a question. I'm just going to go for the question that has more likes, which is, oh, I lost it. Um, I think someone must have like replied to it because it had like 2 likes and now it isn't. It's gone. But we have a question from Juan that says, how do you respond to questions about impact of eliminating parking for new square footage on existing homes, small businesses in neighborhoods built in 20s and 30s without off-street parking?
Casey, sure, go for it.
I can speak to that. So Connecticut's a very old state. We grew a lot and then we instituted zoning in the 1950s and we've essentially not grown since. So we are built very much around train lines, very much around tram lines, very much around grids. We haven't sprawled to the extent many, many states have. And that's why upfront we went and mapped all the parking because we knew that would be a big issue. Someone is going to come in Greenwich or Fairfield right outside New York City, one of the train line suburbs, and say, well, my town is special. We're really old. We don't have parking. And being able to counter that with actual facts and data to be able to say, you know what, your town is actually 57% parking. I think you may be able to fit a little bit more housing in and it'll be okay. That has helped. And obviously it still popped up. Given that we were all part-timers, we didn't try to fight it too hard other than pointing to the data in Connecticut. But that is one way we found to kind of help with those concerns.
Nick, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I would we deal a lot with this sort of aging housing stock here in New Hampshire too. And one thing that comes up, and totally echo that sort of block by block challenges here, but big picture, we talk a lot about how most of these communities grew prior to zoning and prior to restrictive parking requirements, prior to specific housing typologies, and you couldn't build a duplex, you couldn't build a triplex. And so we highlight like the main streets that people love that are built prior to all these regulations. And so that is one area where we start to think about, hey, you love your downtown could not be built right now because of the laws that are in place. And so flipping that sort of aging piece sort of on its head when it's appropriate and when it makes sense.
Catie, go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to add, we had this one woman who testified in every committee. She was amazing. She bought an old historic commercial building, used to be a laundromat that was vacant for a number of years, and turned it into a cider brewery, theater, dance company. Like multiple different organizations were using this building to host their community or their business. And you could like literally see on all the legislators' faces, like they were like just so tickled, right? This is such a heartwarming example of a downtown historic building that got reused, and having existing buildings be exempt from parking minimums so that type of building reuse can happen. It felt like such a no-brainer. It's such a feel-good story.
So much of this is always just like, show people, here's this thing you love. You could have more of this. Like, or here's why you can't have nice things, like just connecting those dots.
Yeah, what's the alternative? Like you never
Yeah.
want the building to be reused again because it was built before parking minimums. Like it's not a good look.
Right. Well, and what's the alternative is the question to so much of this, right? Like you're steering the conversation away from the what if with the status quo presumed, what could go wrong if we pass this bill? Well, what's the alternative to what could go right if we pass this bill? There was one question I noticed at the very top of the chat that I wanted to not have get lost. And it was from our friends in Australia. A question. Australia is really behind on parking reform. We're in a very conservative state and council. What do you suggest are the first and second places to start for parking reform in the outer suburbs on the urban fringe? Casey, share.
Okay, I'm off mute. Great. So start somewhere. I am somebody who doesn't have an organization. I am somebody who just started posting on Twitter a couple of years ago and making friends and making allies. And then all of a sudden, I wrote a bill that got introduced and passed through committee this year. So just start making friends, start putting it yourself out there, and you'll be shocked at the friends you make.
Yeah, Felicity, please.
Yeah, I would just say to start with small businesses is actually, I think, a great thing. And we've kind of touched on it here. I think a lot of people think for housing and whatnot, like the parking is kind of required. You store your car there, blah, blah. But like with the small businesses and so many of the examples we've even heard today, it's like really limiting growth. And, you know, even in the most conservative places, that's something they can fundamentally understand, the government overreach, the things we didn't do because of the parking. And a great example, and I can put it in the chat, the Dallas Urbanists. So Dallas did manage to get some great parking reform done, which we're very excited about. Again, another reason why we're feeling positive about the future of parking in Texas. But one of the things they really focused on was how everyone has to get variances to get their parking approved in Dallas. And it's like, if your variance process is how you're doing this, then the system's broken. Like you have to have new rules that don't require the variance. So the same thing, if you go and talk to the people who are managing the parking in your neighborhood or your municipality, and there's all these dumb workarounds, that says the reform is required. And even conservatives or people who are pro-efficiency, whatever the reason is, you're more than likely there's something there that people will latch onto, conservative or liberal or whatever. So we might have some places in North Carolina talking about environmental benefits, but in a place like Texas, that's definitely what we focus on, is the things that are pro-business, deregulatory, things that make sense to the most conservative voices, because parking impacts everybody and you can always find a way to explain it that resonates with what they believe for the most part.
Ryan.
Yeah, so this may be news to some. This might be the only thing you remember I say, but the Andy Griffith Show was based in North Carolina. So that is a very popular show still in North Carolina. So we talk about Mayberry a lot. And Mayberry is on the fringe of one of our big cities. And do you want your Mayberry to become a Walmart parking lot? So we talk about preserving that rural identity, preserving that mainstream, preserving that idyllic home space in defense of the Lowe's, Home Depot. Lowe's is a North Carolina company, the Home Depot parking lot. So we talk about that a lot.
Right. I want to point out to anyone who's not watching the chat that they're like throughout this whole thing, there have also been a bunch of great answers to the questions posed in the chat. Both our panelists and others have answered in text, including people who I know are doing great advocacy work. We could have had a 12-person panel today if we wanted to have utter chaos. We didn't, but some of those folks have been engaging in the chat. So really, really great sort of accumulated wisdom and insights there. I have a question that I wanted to draw out of something that Felicity commented in the chat about the state APA. I'm curious what folks' experiences are. You know, is the planning profession where you are? Is it an ally in the fight for parking reform? Is it an opponent? Are they wary of being perceived as political or involved? And how do we, you know, knowing that the burden, I don't think anybody becomes a planner. As someone who went to planning school, no one becomes a planner because they want to process parking variances. Like that is not the thrill of the job. How do we get the planning profession engaged in a constructive way in this issue in places where they're not? And Felicity, I'll let you have the first word there.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you came back to this, because it was one of the, I will say, one of the only bad moments in the time we had talking about parking in Texas was essentially the Texas APA came up and said point blank, oh, this is how we get affordable housing for our developers in Texas. Like they literally said, this is a trade-off. You get less parking, you get more affordable housing. And like for me as a housing person, like it makes my skin crawl to even say that out loud. Like it's just not the way parking should be managed. It's not the way we should be thinking about affordable housing. It's a terrible thing that we're just getting tied together. And the state APA was literally up there justifying it. So it just like made me feel horrific about the whole interconnection between those two and how I would like to see that be very different. So I will say, like, having shared that comment and that clip with a lot of other planners in Texas, they had the same reaction I did. That's not what they want to be doing as planners. And to your point, that's not what they signed up for when they went to planning school. So I think there's a lot of understanding amongst planners themselves that this is not necessarily the best way to do it. But unfortunately, when you're talking about a trade association like the Planners Association or the Texas APA in particular, they have older members who don't necessarily have those on the, it's been a long time since they've actually worked in municipal government, or they see the whole issue very differently. So, and I will say the national APA has done a great job of really reframing around some pro-housing and anti-parking things. So I really want to give them credit as a national group for trying to steer the conversation in the right direction. I think a lot of the state level folks, and particularly older planners or people who may be in charge just because they've been around for a long time, they don't have that same understanding. And that's going to take a lot of conversation. I'm going to say it's not always going to have to come from me because I'm not a planner. So I need the people in their own organizations to say to them, hey, this is not how we want to be represented at the Texas legislature. And I think they did get a fair amount of blowback for saying it so baldly. So I'm hoping that we're going to continue those conversations and get them to change to align more with the national groups or to listen to their own membership who's younger and actually working on this on the ground.
Great. Yeah. That interesting to me that, this seems to just cross some, political or cultural boundaries, that the Texas APA is doing exactly the same thing that the California APA drove me nuts by doing a few years ago, which was arguing we need parking mandates as a bargaining chip to bring developers to the table to extract affordability or other concessions out of them, which and Mike Manville, the UCLA professor, wrote a great sort of diatribe against that sort of pretextual planning where the an ordinance exists not because it is viewed as being directly in the public interest, but so that it can be bargained away. Um, I think just really calling that out as just sort of grossly abusive of what the planning process is supposed to be is valuable. Catie, yeah.
Yeah, I guess in my experience, I feel like planning staff can be a bit of a mixed bag. Some of the cities that were opposed to the parking reform sent their testimony through their planning director, right, as kind of the spokesperson for saying, no, we really like these rules. We want to keep them. It's more nuanced than what you're doing at the state level here. But also some of my biggest allies have also been people within planning departments. And when, right, a lot of them would like to have change, but they don't think their city council might be up for it, right? And the advice that I often give them, right, there's a few things that planners have special information about, right? What's the history of your parking mandates? Do you know where they come from? If you don't know where they come from, say it out loud. This is something that you are the authority on. If you don't know where they come from, it needs to be said. How much time does this take your staff to process all this paperwork, right? And for the cities that have eliminated parking mandates, right? How much easier has your permitting process gotten because of this? Those are some really good aspects that allies in the planning department can really help with that other voices can't.
I've seen some really staggering anecdotes here and there about the percentage of planning staff time that goes to just dealing with administering the parking regulations. Nick, you wanted to add something on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I was thinking about how we've interacted with some sort of local municipal planners and local municipal electeds writ large, especially in relation to that Australia question, is around like finding some local champion or some local planner or community that wants to take that first step, and then being able to use that as a proof point was very helpful for us. And so oftentimes that was a combination of, some local town councilor or planning board chair who believed in this and believed that this was the right way to go, talking with their municipal staff, moving things forward, and then being able to highlight examples that we could then take to the state legislature. And as a New Hampshire example of a community that did this and it's worked, but that started with identifying individual level people, because like he said, it's a totally mixed bag from our experience as to whether folks want to be helpful at all or even agree that this is the right way forward. But finding those champions, developing them, getting those proof points can be a great place to start. And the municipal staff is a great resource there.
Really great advice. Love that. We got a little bit more time. We can maybe take one or two more questions in the chat if I see one pop up there. In the meantime, I'll ask one that I had in my back pocket here, which is, what is something that parking reform advocates or parking reform supportive lawmakers should not do What have we learned we should not do, either because it's unproductive or counterproductive? Any of our panelists want to have a go at that one?
I can jump in there and you'll probably notice theme pick fights. This message and this change is so adaptable that you can talk to the most Republican, the most Democrat, and find some sort of common ground. Picking fights doesn't work. I found kind of deflecting to saying, hey, look how stupid these are. Your town requires 8 parking spaces for a bowling alley or for a bowling lane. And then they say, oh, maybe I don't actually hate you. And it's really just an act of humility. The world around us is complex. These rules are very simple and they don't really fit the need for our communities today or yesterday or tomorrow. So that was kind of our biggest approach, just to avoid fights to the greatest extent we could.
Nick.
We did have some, at least one legislator who was talking about this as a way for the future to be self-driving cars and not needing parking spaces. And so obviously that was not a message coming from us, but we had to reach out afterwards and talk with them and say, look, that is not like, you're going to lose people by being so out there with what, that's not what we're trying to do. And that's not what the benefit is. And so while I think hopefully no advocate on this Zoom would do that, but being sure to take your allies and legislators and making sure that they aren't causing you, the best of your ability, headaches in the future with messages that are going to be very problematic and distract you is one piece of advice I would have.
Felicity says in the chat that talking point would totally work in Texas. So read the room locally and tailor your message to your audience. So much of this is one-on-one persuasion. But yeah, a little message discipline there, making sure that your allies aren't actively turning people off to your cause with things they're saying. Catie, your hand is up.
Yeah, my biggest advice is don't talk about mode shift. Like, especially people on the left who want to talk about the environmental benefits and who want to support better transit and biking and all that good stuff that we love. It's just, it buys you so little support and it actually invites a lot more skepticism. It's there were a few people that testified that didn't own cars from Seattle. And they like played right into our opposition's hands in a way of, this is a reform for big cities with robust transit, but it can't work in my small town. Yeah, just try to steer all the way over from that conversation. Say nobody has to give up their car. Nobody has to stop driving for this reform to make sense. Someone who owns 1 car, but they're required to build a house with 4 parking spots, right? Like that is a much more relatable example. So even in the long term, of course, you can build a better transit network without parking minimums. It's a really long-term kind of vision. The same thing with climate change and sprawl. It seems really far in the future, but like an actual building that got denied a permit last year, or a parking lot that would like to infill but cannot right now, is like a much more relatable example of something that can happen right now. And we're not waiting for the world to change for this reform to make sense. So.
And if I can really quickly build off Catie, similarly avoiding geographic fights, a lot of people will say, well, my area doesn't have transit, therefore I need parking. And what I would always do is I'd pivot to a Kohl's in Connecticut that was required to have 273 parking spaces and say, that number just doesn't make any sense. Who came up with that? It really just applies everywhere. There's just too much that's being required.
One thing I'll just throw in here and kind of echo something that Tony posted in the chat about using a message around choice, trying to find ways to allow people to make different choices, whether that's tenants, whether that's home builders, whether that's small business owners, customers. And there's a way to get at, you can talk about people who don't own cars, but not in a way that's going to be sort of culturally polarizing. Like, oh, this is about this person over here in Seattle, and not about this kind of person over here. One thing we do at PRN, anytime we speak to local decision makers anywhere, is we pull up their local statistics on, you can get this from the census, from data.census.gov, the breakdown of vehicles available to a household by tenure. And what you can show people is, specifically you pull up renter versus owner households in their community and what percentage of them have 0 or 1 vehicle. If you break it down that way, not just 0. Everywhere I've ever looked at, a majority of renter households have either 0 or 1 vehicles available. We did that for Missoula, Montana recently. You can go to places that are really rural, that are really car dependent. You're going to find over 50% of renter households have either 0 or 1 vehicle. So you've reframed it away from car-free people where it's a matter of choice to you have renters in your community right now who are being required to pay for parking they're not going to use. Who are going to be required to subsidize someone else's parking that they're not going to use. Because almost everywhere you have a parking requirement for rental units that is 1 stall per unit or more. So those households, I think there is a way to call that out where it's about choice and it's about, even if you think you're a car dependent community, there are people in your community right now who are being forced to subsidize parking that they're never going to use. Ryan, sorry for making you wait. Your hand's been up here.
No, it's all good. It's always I always love hearing from Catie because it's like we have such different political dynamics, but then like she'll say something like, "Oh my God, that's my worst nightmare," and about like the cyclists. And I know like I ride a bike, my wife rides a bike, we all love riding our bikes. But what I would say is don't trade one arbitrary number for another, and don't create like an arbitrary number loophole. So like I'll be honest, we pissed off the bicycle community in North Carolina. They wanted to have minimums for bicycles. And I said, look, the one thread between all our bill sponsors is this undying hatred of arbitrary numbers. And if they ask me where did that number come from, and I just say, well, the bike people wanted it, I'm gonna get yelled at. And I don't like getting yelled at. So I think it's a really easy thing that we can say, is this one thing, is this a magic bullet fix for all our mobility issues? And the answer is no, but it is a good step in the right direction. So just, I would caution anyone about trading your arbitrary numbers around.
I want to give everyone a chance to kind of have a closing word here. So to all 6 of our panelists, I want to put the question, what is your biggest takeaway from your work in the past year, from this past legislative session? What is the biggest kind of lesson learned that the broader parking reform movement can learn something from? And Nick, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, thanks again for bringing us all together and having this conversation, because I do love hearing from all of our different colleagues around different states who are doing work, because it's so interesting that, in many respects, you have to be careful about your own state's political dynamic and taking all the advice that you've heard today and your own experiences and what you've done and make it work for your community or your state and your legislative dynamics. But at the same time, there are so many trends that we're seeing state to state to state in these same pitfalls that if you can avoid, you could put yourself on a path to success. And I guess I would just say, if you're in a state where it's been struggling or you haven't been able to get the traction, hopefully this has provided some level of hope that it's possible, that there are a lot of progress that's being made in states around the country. And, for us, we were having bills that were voted down just a couple of years ago, and now they're being signed into law. And so change can happen quick, but we can make it possible, and the work of and great resources from so many on this call.
Thank you so much. Ryan, how about you next?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And thank you again. I'll second Nick's gratitude for bringing us all together. This is such an issue that there's so many different strange bedfellows that you could have for this. So if you're doing like state level lobbying and you're in a Dillon's rule state, I guarantee you about 85%, I'd push 90% of every lobbyist at your legislature would totally get on board for one of these bills. Depends on what else you throw in it. But they'll love this provision. But there's a lot of different types of people. I mean, goodness, even on this call, on this panel, it's a wide array. So go out and just figure out who could possibly care about eliminating parking minimums, and they probably will. They just need someone to point it out to them, and that could be you. It should be you.
Felicity, how about you next?
Yeah, so I'm going to use one word here because I think it's our mantra, which is educate, educate, educate. We just really got caught off guard, honestly, this session, not expecting a parking reform bill, having one dropped in our lap and realizing how little our state legislatures actually understand this issue and how much it is a local sort of, oh, that's something that my local planner does. So, getting people to understand how the unnecessary rules and regulations around parking, how it's damaging the economy, all these things that we've been talking about, that actually requires a lot of outreach and education, particularly to a group of people who don't necessarily think it's their job to fix it. So that's kind of our mantra is going to be, hey, we got a teeny tiny step forward on this in Texas. So let's really do the work of outreach and education in the next 18 months. So when we come back, we have a bunch of anti-parking, pro-parking reform warriors ready to step up and really have this conversation in a much more thoughtful and in-depth way. But that requires us to do that advocacy between now and then, and we're up for it.
Nathan, what's your final word from Montana?
Yeah, I mean, I think go big. So like going for the best possible version of the bill by having the commercial and residential uses in there allowed us to negotiate pretty easily, I guess, to pull those commercial things out, with the exception of the childcare and assisted living, which I think is just generally easier to kind of get in there. But allowed us to pull those out and keep the residential stuff relatively unchanged throughout the process and get that passed through as well. And so I think, yeah, don't negotiate with yourself before you introduce something. Just go for the whole thing.
Don't negotiate with yourself before you introduce something. Yes, please. I think a lot of us think we're working on this this sort of out there wonky thing, and we're not. Like a couple panelists have already said, you can make the case to almost anyone building a bridge between something they care about to this issue. So I think this year has shown us that it is possible to go big. Casey, how about you next?
I love that, Nathan. That's exactly the approach we use in Connecticut, and that's kind of how we ended up where we did. But feel free to draft off everyone else. There's 6 different perspectives here that have been talking. There's a bunch of people who've done other state and local. Everybody just started trying. Everybody just started reaching out and giving it a go. That's what we did in Connecticut, and you'll be shocked at the level of uptake. And it just kind of happened suddenly, as Felicity said. We came out of nowhere in Connecticut. Nobody knew anything about any parking reform, and all of a sudden we almost got a complete statewide repeal passed just because we tried. So make some friends, go out there, give it a go, and you'll be surprised at how successful or how much people are looking for a solution like this.
Catie, I'll have you close us out here. What's your
Oh my
your final
gosh, I
takeaway?
have so many advice, but yes, with the go big, I think your opposition, the details of the bill actually don't matter. They're going to make the argument that people still drive and they need parking, and you're like, we agree, let's move on. We changed some of the numbers in our bill introduction draft to be more aggressive at the start before we introduced the bill this year, thinking they'd get negotiated, and they didn't. Right? So no parking for any dwelling under 1,200 square feet. We're still like amazed that's the law now. My other piece, especially for this panel, I'm remembering how last summer at like this time, I was drafting a one-pager for legislators about here's a menu of options for different parking reforms using examples of what other states had passed or had introduced and how different that list would be right now just because of the progress this year is really inspiring. We are doing things that were politically impossible 5 years ago, and like all of our efforts in every state, even if they are not winning yet, like we are helping each other and making this like seem like a more common sense reform that it always has been, and we're having this moment and just to get as much as we can out of it right now. So my work wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for people in other states. Also, we're very interdependent. So I'm just like amazed to be in this room with all of these people.
I love so much that this room exists and that we can bring all of these people together and we can inform each other's work and just motivate each other to see what we can get done. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. Paula, I think we've got a couple kind of closing housekeeping notes, words from PRN if you want to take the mic back. But thank you so much, all of you. This has been just an awesome discussion.